It is August 29th, 2016 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Admissions Live. I'm your host today, Adam Castro, and on today's live broadcast, we're talking about how changes to FAFSA filing and procedures will affect how recruiters interact with prospective students and parents this fall and beyond. Admissions Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live broadcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in the industry. Today's live viewing experience is powered by Maestro, a premier marketing tech platform for broadcasters. All episodes of Admission Live are free and accessible in the video archives at higheredlive.com and in podcast format on iTunes. Today's episode is made possible by Chegg Enrollment Services. Chegg is a leading student marketing firm focused on helping institutions save time, save money, and recruit smarter. Leveraging a multi-channel approach that includes digital search sites, social media marketing, and direct-to-student messaging, Chegg's Enrollment Services can help you accelerate response time while capturing real-time student interest. Visit edu.chegg.com/insights to learn more about Chegg's most recent student research and recorded professional development webinars. Well, I'm really excited to have my guests on today and talk about this incredibly important issue. I think all of higher education to this point has been inundated with information about early FAFSA and prior year, but a lot of the talk has been about the nuts and bolts, the timelines, the changes, and I don't think there's been enough talk about how this is going to impact students, parents, and even recruiters as we recruit for this next cycle on the admission side. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. So we're going to go over a couple of things. We're going to very briefly define early FAFSA and prior year for you. We're going to discuss how colleges have, and in some cases have not, adapted to these changes. We're going to explore ways admission counselors can use and promote prior year on the road to help with their own recruiting. And finally, navigate some potential ripple effects PPY could have on compliance issues at the local and national levels. So in order to do that today, I have three amazing guests that I want to introduce to you guys. First is Megan McLean. She is the Vice President of Policy and Federal Relations at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, otherwise known as NASFA. Welcome. We also have Louis Hirsch, former Director of Admission at the University of Delaware and current chair of NACAC's Admission Practices Committee. Louis, welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Isaiah Tolbert, admission counselor at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York, who's going to give us the road warrior perspective. Welcome, Isaiah. So for those of you that are watching along today, and we appreciate you doing so, please don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have about the topic. If you use the hashtag HigherEdLive, or you tweet me directly at the handle you see on the screen, I'll do my best to navigate those questions and get them to the right person and have those answered on the air for you. So in terms of an introduction, I just want to make it clear that this episode is not a webinar of the nuts and bolts of prior year. This is a strategic talk about how this change is going to affect kind of the marketplace, and particularly as it relates to the admission side of the industry. We all know the changes in prior year. Essentially, we've moved up the FAFSA filing date 3 months to October 1st, and students can now use prior year's tax information instead of the current year. Two very important changes, both for students and obviously the offices of admission and offices of financial aid. And we're going to delve into that a little bit further and how it relates to the recruitment side. And I do want to kind of preface the talk with addressing something that we love in higher ed, and that's acronyms and nicknames for these type of things. So I'm going to refer to prior year as early FAFSA. I might refer to it as PPY. These are all the same things. The idea that students are now going to be able to file their FAFSA earlier, and in turn, hopefully, get financial aid award offers earlier as well. But we're going to dive into that in a little bit. So I really want to start off and kick it off with questions for Megan. And first, I just want you to see if you can describe for us your role at NASFA and how it relates to this prior year phenomenon.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Adam, for including NASFA as a part of this webcast today. As Adam mentioned, we are the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, and here at NASFA, I oversee our policy and federal relations team, and we are very intimately involved in the implementation of prior year, but we were also very involved in advocating for this change as well. So it's something that we have worked on and done research on for about 6 or 7 years here at NASFA. And so we worked very closely with folks on Capitol Hill and the White House to see this change happen. And now, of course, with the change coming and coming very quickly, we are very invested and interested in making sure the implementation goes as smoothly as possible from a financial aid administrator standpoint. But we've certainly, and I think we'll probably talk about this later, also been very involved with our other key stakeholders across campus and helping our members navigate that.
So can you talk a little bit about what, and nobody likes to speak on behalf of the Department of Education, but if you could for a moment talk a little bit about what was the original intent of prior year from the department's perspective, and if there are 2 to 3 main drivers that you think really led to this change.
Sure. Well, I think one of the great things about prior year, I'll just say up front, is that it's one single policy change that really has several positive implications. And so the top 3 things I would say is first, simplification. Moving to prior year and the early FAFSA really will streamline the process for a lot of students because more students can use the data retrieval tool from the IRS, and so that will make that application process less of a barrier. Going to October 1 will provide more time for students and families to make those important decisions about financial aid, so we're hopeful that some of the packages will be out earlier so students can have some more time to think about those important decisions. And then finally, I know the department and NASFA as well was interested in reducing verification burden, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about later, not only for institutions but also for students as well. So those 3 things were the top drivers.
Yes. Coming from a very high-need student population in my institution, the verification burden is something that I'm very interested in, and hoping that this is a great change from that perspective. So can you talk a little bit about how your organization is currently working on an assessment plan for prior year one? What are you looking for in terms of success or room for improvement in year 1?
Yeah, we have a prior year implementation task force right now that is currently planning on trying to figure out how to best assess prior year. And so I think what we want to do is survey our members probably later in the fall, see how many of them moved deadlines, see those who didn't, what worked well for them, what didn't, what was the impact on students, particularly what was the impact on our lowest income students, because we want this to be a good thing for those students in particular. So we'll do an assessment probably at the end of this calendar year and then one again in the spring, and we will modify our guidance and our training as such to make sure that this continues to be a smooth implementation.
Great. And so bringing this all kind of back to the idea of recruitment, Lou, I want to turn it to you, and
Sure.
being director of admission at a very large institution, I think you're a great person to ask the question is, how is this early FAFSA, in a very general sense, going to impact the recruitment side?
Yeah, of course, anything you say at this stage is conjecture, so that's what I'm doing. I'm making a conjecture, but I think the thing that leaps out at me is this. The recruitment cycle has always been designed so that the fall semester was always your final push to present your institution, appealing to the families, try to get students fascinated by what you have to offer. You talked about your programs, your beautiful campus, and you post in the spring the more detailed conversation about costs and affordability. And it was always easy to do that because, of course, people couldn't file FAFSAs until after January 1, and many filed significantly after that, usually February or March, because they were waiting to do their income taxes before they could file. Well, think for a moment what this change means to that fall-spring split. You're going to be seeing students on your campus in the fall, and many of them are going to come from families where the parents have just logged on to the website for the FAFSA, have filed FAFSAs, and have gotten their student aid reports with their expected family contribution. And put yourself in the psychological frame of mind. Most people, when they first see that expected family contribution, respond with shock. I mean, the usual reaction is, the feds think I can afford to pay that. And so you're seeing a bunch of people who are coming to your campus with a primary thing on their minds is sticker shock. How am I going to pay for all this stuff? And I think that's potentially a huge change. Another possibility, which I do wonder about, is, are families going to make a decision about where to apply to college contingent on whether the schools they're looking at can assure them in advance, even before they apply, that the school is going to be affordable? I think that could have a very significant change on admissions marketing, on how we structure our fall visit programs, what we say when we're on the road in the fall. So that's how I see it, is at least conjecturing.
We'll take it, and I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of my next question. Is, if you're getting an admission team ready for this improvement cycle, I mean, fall travel starts essentially in earnest in about 2 weeks. What are you doing? You're sitting your team down. You're going over the 2 or 3 top things that they need to be aware of. What are those things, and how do you get them excited about this initiative?
Well, I think any admissions enrollment manager is going to have to alert her staff or his staff to the fact that, first of all, you're going to be getting a lot more questions than you're used to getting about cost and affordability, because that's what's on people's minds. They've just filed a FAFSA, as I just mentioned. If a family is really savvy, the second thing you may encounter is that they will have gone onto your website and sought out your net price calculator, because they've got an actual EFC now. They can plug into that net price calculator. If you're like the 98% of the colleges in this country who gap, that is, who do not meet full demonstrated financial need, then people are going to start seeing perhaps significant gaps between even that, what the FAFSA says they can afford and what the institution is likely to come up with for them. So you're going to get questions about that gap, questions about how much loan indebtedness a student might get. Be prepared for that. And the third thing I'd say to them, and it's more, I guess a piece of advice would be, I think what a lot of institutions would be well advised to do is give the message that, look, yes, a net price calculator is telling you something, but it's an estimate and it's based on a lot of prior experience. The thing that will be important is to be able to assure families that financial aid officers are willing to talk individually with them and understand that each family's situation is in some sense unique, and that the goal is to find a path towards affordability, because you need to assuage the fears that many people are going to experience when they first see an expected family contribution.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you brought up an interesting point about the net price calculator, and I've always had this concern, and this might even exacerbate that concern, that colleges are almost forced to be very conservative on their net price calculator. So essentially, in many cases, particularly at the private schools, they're not going to go out with the best financial aid award offer because they can't risk the idea of over-awarding a student on the net price calculator.
Right.
I think even that is not giving the student the best, the most realistic view of what they would have to pay at an institution. So I think moving, the FAFSA filing up and extending that conversation between the student and the institution can only be a good thing. So let's move it to our man on the ground. Let's move it to Isaiah. He's the one that's going to be dealing with this in the next couple of weeks and fielding those questions from students and parents. So Isaiah, as a recruiter, how have you personally prepared yourself for these changes?
Sure, I've started to prepare in a few different ways. The first one is really figuring out what are the different mindsets families are in. And you really can't assume where families are in the process anymore. In November, you may have families that have already submitted their FAFSA, submitted their application, and now they're in wait and anxious mode. And also in November, you could have families who are only in research and visit mode with no FAFSA. And so the reality is for us as admissions counselors that we need to be more aware of where the families are in the buying process. And we also need to know about the transactions that a family has completed or hasn't completed yet. We also know that the whole enrollment relationship isn't just the admissions relationship, it's also with the financial aid process. I guess also another way I've been preparing is from a data perspective, I need to access the financial aid information, not necessarily the small granular details, but more about the submission of the of the FAFSA. What we've done here at Nazareth is that we've re-engineered the flow of information so that the financial aid information flows back and forth between the student information system along with the financial aid information system too, which uses PowerFades. So yeah, those are really the main ways that we've really been ready for some of those planning and also understanding the mindsets of the family, and then also understanding that with the FAFSA, it's another valuable data point to prioritize our top inquiries.
So I think those are great points, and I think the idea of learning more about the financial aid side is both excites admission professionals and also scares them, because you're talking about much more delicate information and data on the student's record. So all that being said, what do you think are the opportunities for a guy like you that has a territory that's going to be trying to cultivate that territory? What opportunities do you see for the prepared admission counselor that's ready to leverage prior year?
Sure. The two main, I'd say, opportunities that I see are being that trusted advisor within the admissions process. I already see myself as that already, but even more so because families could be anywhere within the buying process or looking or submitting a FAFSA or applying, and I need to make sure I ask those questions explicitly so now I can help them and really give them great service as they're going through the process. I want to make sure they have a really phenomenal experience when they're going through this process. For some, they could be a first-generation student, or some families already have students already in college, but we need to make sure that we're treating every family with that great service and being that trusted advisor. And then another opportunity that I see is making the submission of the FAFSA form as a priority as a next step, making sure that they are well prepared going through that process and make sure that form is submitted.
Yeah, I mean, all fantastic points. So I was trying to think about my recruitment days. I came up as an admission counselor and I was a recruiter. And probably my worst nightmare back then was for a student or a parent to come up with financial aid documentation and start asking me questions. So that I can totally see that happening this year. A savvy student, has their SAR, they're walking around from college to college at their high school fair, asking for answers. So do you anticipate, getting more specific financial aid questions as part of the recruitment process?
Yes, I do, but probably more about the process and the procedure more than about the specific financial aid award. I'll have view into the aid of a student, but we really want the experts to handle the details of family financing decisions. That's something that at a high school fair or at a college visit, that's something that I'm prepared to do. So I think really working with my colleagues in financial aid and making sure the experts have total control of the financing information.
And that's a great point. Leads me to my next question is, has your institution, put anything, official on their admission counselor saying, this is what you can talk about, this is what you can't talk about, this is what you need to refer to a financial aid counselor, anything, any kind of hard and fast rules you guys put in place?
We haven't made any rules, but if we deliver just the quality, exceptional service, then we'll know what we can help and what we can't help on. We have a great relationship with financial aid, so co-managing relationships won't be a problem. But this is a big change for my financial aid colleagues as well, and we need to make sure we support them instead of inundating them with too many questions that we should answer.
Yeah, there's definitely no off-season for financial aid anymore. If there was ever an off-season, there's certainly no off-season in admissions anymore. So we're all on level playing fields, I guess. So that brings me to Megan. I want to pull you in for a quick follow-up on one of Isaiah's points, and if you can just talk about the guidance that NASPA has given financial aid directors across the country in terms of preparing their staff for prior year?
Yeah, we actually have a whole toolkit that's available for our members, and that toolkit includes a variety of different resources. Some of them are very technical in nature. One of the interesting things about the implementation year is for 16-17 and 17-18, you're going to be using the same year's family income. And so that presents some technical things that I won't get into here, but if there are any financial aid folks listening, that would be of interest to you. But we've also put out a lot of resources to help our members really spread the word via consumer information and making sure students and families are understanding, why am I filling out the form here in October? I just did it in January, that type of thing. So we have a timeline builder tool that's on our website that helps the admissions and financial aid offices develop a nice timeline for their schools, because this year is going to be tricky because we have 2 award years using 1 year's family income, and there's going to be overlap. We also have a nice little short video that we developed that explains, just what the heck prior year is, and so I would encourage the admission folks to check that out and use it as a resource as well. We have a blog series that we're doing to help our members understand what some different schools are doing across the country. So that's really designed sort of in the best practices mode. You hear from a certain school that says, here's what we're doing, this is how it's working for us. And then we also have a series of materials that help financial aid offices figure out who else needs to be pulled into this discussion. Certainly admissions, but there's also a lot of other different units across the campus that you might not have initially thought of that need to be looped into this process, even including, media and PR and even the business offices to a certain extent. And I'll just make a plug, because these materials are all available to everyone and they're not member protected at NASFA, that if anybody wants to go to the toolkit, it's www.nasfa.org/PPY toolkit, and any of those videos or publications there that are designed to help students and families, we welcome you all to use and push out.
Awesome, and we'll get that URL tweeted out also after the show, and definitely check that out. I think one of the most important things you said is kind of benchmarking what you're doing against what other colleges and universities are doing across the country. I think one of the things that's going to be extremely interesting about prior year is exactly when it's all said and done, year one, how many people, how many colleges and universities, how many administrators made significant changes to prepare for prior year, and how many kind of sat back and just kind of let everything happen and are going to react in year 2. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, coming from a private institution that's enrollment dependent in a very competitive arena. I mean, one of the first conversations we had is, do we have to be aggressive with this? I mean, do we have to make some hard and fast and quick decisions on how we're going to react to prior year? Whereas, some other institutions, maybe a state institution, a public flagship, for instance, maybe doesn't have to make those changes quite so quickly and kind of sit back and see how this all changes kind of their day-to-day operations. And it's something that we're going to have to see over the next few months for certain. I want to talk a little bit about challenges. There will be a few, I believe, and I think we're going to learn a lot as we go. And I'd love to start out with Lou, and I just want to throw out a couple and to get your perspective on it. And first is kind of that never-ending race to get financial aid award offers in students' hands. With now moving up the deadline 3 months, you're essentially moving up your ability to package for 3 months. How important is it to get a financial aid offer in a student's hands as early in the process as possible?
It can be, and probably is, very important. An enrollment manager's real worry is you certainly don't want to wait so long that you've reached a point where most of your students have already set their hearts on other colleges and universities. There's a tipping point where it's very hard then to get a student to focus back on your own institution. And certainly getting an early financial aid package out is a good way of saying to a kid or to a family, yes, we like you, yes, we want to have you, we care enough about you that we've tried to move heaven and earth to get you answers as quickly as we can. The problem, of course, is, and the real worry I have, is that this will lead to some kind of early financial aid packaging arms race. And there are a lot of institutions that, for very good reasons, are not in a very good position to produce financial aid packages in October and November. For example, you can be a state university who doesn't even get your budgets from your legislatures until well into the spring. It's very hard to package people for financial aid if you don't have those budgets. You can be a private institution that's very tuition dependent, who really would like to get a better handle on tuition revenue, including revenue from your returning students. It's probably not till spring semester that you get a better handle on what the return rate there will be. So that's problematic for a lot of schools, and I think that arms race possibility has got me concerned.
Definitely has me concerned as well. I think from what I'm hearing for institutions like mine, it's going to be you got to be accurate. Obviously, you have to get an accurate financial aid estimate in front of the student, but you also have to be early. Particularly if you know a student's going to be applying to 8 to 12 schools and sending their FAFSA to at least 6, 7, or 8 of those if they're admitted to the institution. So I think it's going to be extremely important. So I wanted to go back to Megan and kind of ask, what is NASFA's reaction to this? And I think Lou put it perfectly in calling it an arms race. We don't want to overblow this, but that's certainly what it could turn out to be. So is there any kind of guidance or any type of discussion happening in NASFA in terms of making sure that colleges and universities are being ethical when it comes to the financial aid award arms race?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, one of the benefits that we touted of prior years, the potential to get students their financial aid packages earlier, but, we completely agree that this needs to be done in a responsible way, and that there really is kind of a delicate balance that we really do need to strike. And every school is different, so we don't have any sort of concrete guidance on this, but we just want schools, to be mindful if they're moving their deadlines and getting their packages out earlier to, we really believe that each school knows their population the best, and so to be mindful and careful and to work with their community partners and the folks in the feeder high schools and things like that to make sure that everyone is aware of any new deadlines. The challenge that kind of exists is, schools are looking to get those packages out earlier, and that's a really difficult thing to do if they don't, in fact, move their priority deadlines. And so we're also trying to get out some education about what a priority deadline means. So, for example, many schools will say, and every school is different, but, the priority deadline is just that, it's priority, and there are still funds available afterward. But a lot of folks don't know that, because when you hear deadline, you think of that as kind of being the final be-all, end-all. So we're trying to educate folks about that as well. And I'll just say that I do think there are many schools this year who are kind of just sitting tight, seeing what their competitors are doing, and maybe going to wait till next year to make any change. So that's why I kind of think that follow-up from the first year that we talked about a little bit ago is really important and will be helpful to schools.
Great. And so, Isaiah, I want to talk a little bit, and you touched on it earlier, and I think it's a really important point, is this idea of improving and increased coordination between admission and financial aid offices. So, from your perspective, does PPY pull financial aid more into pre-yield recruitment activities?
Yes. But we have an established culture of accountability in our enrollment management division, for which we're all working towards the same goals. Meaning, financial aid works on process, regulatory requirements, service, etc., but are very focused on meeting net tuition revenue and enrollment goals. Thus, our relationship is very, very productive. With that being said, we're working together much sooner on family situations or different family situations, and we need to frame expectations very cleanly so that families don't get frustrated. As mentioned before, we're going to market with a recommended enrollment process and not a financial aid process and an admissions process. So to the family, it should just be a singular experience.
I think that's super important that the families don't see this as two offices that aren't working together. I think it's, when you're talking particularly from a new student recruitment standpoint, a seamless transition from every part of kind of the yield calendar, I think is incredibly important. Yeah, and I think this kind of leads me to this idea that the unknown, right? The unknown of PPY, the unknown of early FAFSA, and how it's going to ultimately impact what we're doing here on the recruitment side. So, Lou, from your perspective, do you have any gut feeling about unintended consequences that lay out there particularly for admission offices as it relates to PPY?
Yeah, I do, and I think life's filled with them, isn't it? I'll give you a couple. I mean, for example, under the model that has prevailed, financial aid awards typically went out sometime in March. Families had to decide by May 1 which college they were going to accept. That gave about a 6-week window for a lot of people to haggle about financial aid. And it's pretty common for a lot of families to go to College X and say, College Y's offering me this, can you match it? Well, that's a 6-week period. Imagine now that awards are being tendered as early as the fall. How do colleges feel about not 6 weeks of haggling over financial aid, but maybe 5 or 6 months of back and forth as people keep comparing financial aid offers? That's one intended consequence. A second might be this. If you assume earlier financial aid, you have to assume that there are going to be a lot of students out there who may find that by January 1, they've already been admitted to college, they've already gotten financial aid from the college choices, they're ready to think about commitment. And traditionally, yield activities have all happened in April because May 1's been the deadline. But if there's a strong pressure or feeling the colleges need to get into pushing yield events up, particularly for schools in the northern part of the United States, how do you feel about doing an admissions yield event in February? I mean, think of your own campus, Adam, or Isaiah, think of yours. When it's clogged with snow and ice and nothing is in bloom, that's a very different yield event from the ones you have in April. And so that's perhaps an unintended consequence that could have an impact on people.
So you're saying that the Rochester winters are not the biggest draw?
They might not be. They might not be.
So, I mean, some people love to speak to it, and I completely understand, where you're coming. And I completely agree. The idea that, at any point during the recruitment cycle, particularly the yield cycle, that another institution can come in after you've already accepted and awarded a student and built a great relationship, and at any point from October 1 to May 1, some other institution that you may not know about can come in, and kind of sweep that student off their feet. That's obviously a concern for admission offices all across the country.
It's a nightmare.
There you go. So, Megan, I want to talk about, the concerns from the financial aid perspective. So, the number one concern by far that I've heard from financial aid administrators is regarding federal and state funding timelines. So, estimations for Pell and for whatever state grant is being given out to states that do have the need-based grant. There's going to be an estimate in there. It could be up to 10 months. In New Jersey, in my state, it looks like, TAG is not updated until July 1st every year. So you're going to have that estimated amount, usually last year's amount, on that award letter, maybe for up to 10 months. So can you talk a little bit about the financial aid office's reaction to that?
Yeah, and I'll start by saying the good news is that before going to prior year, we had worked very closely with all of the state grant aid programs, and they had agreed to, first and foremost, use prior year. And the reason I say that's a good thing is because I think we really would have gotten ourselves into a sticky situation if you had the federal government using prior year and some states still using prior year, and that really kind of flies in the face of simplification. So I think that's a good thing. But I completely agree. It does get tough with 50 different states and 50 different programs and different deadlines, which is why I think it's really hard to sort of offer blanket guidance or requirements for schools on, this is what you need to do and this is when your deadlines need to be. We know that every school and every state is different, and my guess is over the next couple years or so, maybe some of those state deadlines might shift. I've really been telling folks that, yes, this is the implementation year for prior year, but I really kind of view it as a 2 to 3 to 4 sort of implementation year rollout. With respect to the federal government, if only Congress could get their budget done on time, we wouldn't have this problem, but we know we can't seem to rely on that, at least for the past decade or so. But we are actually working very closely with folks on the Hill, as is the Department of Education, to try to maybe get those final Pell numbers or Pell tables out earlier. Right now they usually don't come out till after January or so, but there might be a way that we can work within the current law to get those out earlier. And with regard to the other programs, the campus-based programs, a lot of schools actually estimate for those right now, and we have been pretty lucky in the fact that even though this has been a time of great austerity for the federal government, most of the student aid programs have been funded to their anticipated level. So I guess what I'm saying there is, even if you had to estimate, you likely, or history has shown, wouldn't be too far off from what the final number ended up being.
Yeah, absolutely. And allow me, on behalf of all of higher education, allow me to commend you and NASFA on your work with the states, because, I mean, having two separate procedures for filing for state aid and federal aid would have been a complete and utter disaster nightmare. So thank you. And I do want to get Isaiah's perspective on this, because the idea, if I'm a parent and I get a financial aid award offer for my student, and there's estimates all over it, that could be of concern. I mean, how do you think that's going to affect the mindset of a student and their parents, and particularly, a first-gen student that may not know, kind of the ins and outs of the financial aid world?
I don't think it should really scare them off too much if it just says, with a lot of estimates. But I think we're just going to continue to work with the families to ensure that that they feel confident within the process. So it's not just they're hanging out by themselves, but more so that they feel that they have someone to go to at any college, or even just for us at Nazareth, that they feel confident, hey, we're a little confused by this estimate. Where can we gain some more clarity to ensure that we have a bit of a clearer picture in terms of what the award letter may be?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we touched on the hard stuff. So let's talk about the good stuff, the opportunities that are out there. So Lou, there's a bunch of surveys kind of floating around the higher ed space, particularly on social media, about how many people are going to adopt this and how many colleges and universities are going to make significant changes. From what I'm seeing, I see about maybe 2/3 of four-year colleges are going to move their packaging up due to prior year one. The rest taking a wait-and-see approach. So, in your perspective, does a school, quote-unquote, on its game have a competitive advantage with prior year?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to imagine this scenario. Suppose you're a school that has decided to wait and not move up its packaging. And you get a phone call from an irate parent who says, my daughter's other college choices have all given her financial aid awards. You guys have had her FAFSA for 2 months now. Why can't you at least tell me how much it's going to cost to attend? That's not a conversation that many enrollment managers would love to have. So if you're going to wait, fine, but you need to think about how you're going to answer that parent, because my gut feeling is you're going to get phone calls just like that, and that's the problem.
Absolutely. And that's what scared me the most about this change, to be perfectly honest. And the second we learned that prior year was coming, I had to have really frank discussions, with my president, with our board of trustees, and say, we need to be out in front of this. So instead of setting tuition, in February or March, we need to be setting tuition in October. Instead of adopting our financial aid packaging model in March and sending out award letters in late March, we need to move that up. So, by early November, we should be kind of in parallel with our acceptances and our financial aid packages for students that, were admitted and filed their FAFSA. And I think, again, going back to this idea of working in a competitive environment, I think that we absolutely thought that was imperative. Like, we could not compete if we weren't going to make those changes, and I'm just lucky to be at an institution that was really receptive to that, and we moved very quickly. We were very nimble with things like that. But I could see it being a huge challenge, at an institution that could, maybe it's larger, maybe its board of trustees isn't nearly as tuned in to the day-to-day at an institution that won't change their meeting schedule or won't change their agenda that they've been following for years and years and years. And every time, that quarterly meeting is missed, is a missed opportunity to make these changes and move forward. So, and I think after year one, I think everybody's going to be thinking in this way. And I think those that did not jump on board and kind of took a wait-and-see approach are going to rethink that very quickly if I can try to predict the future, and we'll see how that goes. But I do want to talk to Isaiah a little bit about what this means for recruiters. Early financial aid award offers should mean more time for you to really cultivate and develop that relationship, maybe even push more campus visitation, which at most institutions has a direct correlation to yield. So can you talk a little bit about how you think that this could help you in the yield process?
Sure. I think as we talked about a little bit earlier, the FAFSA submission is a great indicator of the interest and demand at your institutions. So I think by having the FAFSA submission, it encourages next steps to a more aware and a more likely to engage prospect pool. And as they're engaging with you back and forth, it's getting back to those phone calls and getting back to those emails. And as they come to the open houses or to a accepted student day, it's continuing to cultivate those relationships. Once again, using the data to ensure, to see if they will deposit and enroll at your institutions.
Great. So I want to circle back to something that we touched on earlier, Megan, and that's verification. It is, on my campus, it's one of those words that you kind of have to whisper, when you talk about it from a procedural standpoint, because it's just, we're inundated with verification requests. Year to year, particularly working with a high-need student population. We get a lot of mistakes in FAFSA. So, I wanted to talk about this idea that prior year will decrease the amount of federal verifications due to the resubmission of 2015 data, particularly for year one. Do you think that's a correct assumption?
Yes, I do. I think it's correct for year one. I think it will also be correct for the following years. And you're absolutely right that verification is a great burden on institutions, but I'll also add that it can be a great burden on students as well, particularly low-income students who are, asked, they feel like they've gotten through that big hurdle of filling out the form, and then they're asked by the school, well, I need this documentation and that documentation, and we hear that sometimes that's a deterrent. The main reason that we believe that verification will be reduced is that most students now will be able to utilize the IRS data retrieval tool on the FAFSA, meaning they'll be able to pull over their tax information directly from the IRS. The federal government has said, and it makes sense, the more information that we get directly from the IRS, the better, because they're not going to really challenge that. If it's coming directly from the IRS, it is what it is. And so we'll be getting more students who are going to be able to import that information, and that will ultimately require a less amount of verification, which is a good thing.
It is a great thing. Yeah. So I hope that you're right, particularly for this to be a trend going forward. I mean, I can tell you it is a huge deterrent for students. I mean, you're exactly right. You think about, you've done everything. You've been admitted, you've gone to a yield event, you've picked your institution, you filed your FAFSA, you got your financial aid award letter, but it comes with a caveat. And the caveat is we're missing, 7 different forms, and you're trying to reach back into your family history and deal with your parents' financials in order to find this information. And for a student that's never been through it before, for a parent that's never been through it before, it is an incredibly daunting thing. And I don't necessarily begrudge students and parents that give up at some point and say, I just can't get through this. There's too much paperwork. There's too much responsibility to get this done. And we really need to walk people through that, and we try our best. But, the answer to it is to decrease the amount of verification so we can really concentrate on the students that have just major issues with filing the FAFSA and the information that they submitted. So I really appreciate that response. I want to talk to Megan and Lou about kind of the federal issues that are going on right now. One really important one is the Undersecretary of Education, Ted Mitchell, has given a directive urging colleges not to institute earlier deadlines for applying for financial aid. What have you seen in terms of compliance from this guidance, year one, and what approach are your organizations taking with this directive? Maybe Lou, why don't you start it off for us?
Well, of course, the approach that NACAC has been taking is a wait and see, and I think that's probably the prudent approach to take. I think some of our members are taking it as well. Others are being a little more proactive with it. Megan, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a tricky situation because, as I mentioned before, earlier in the year there was directive from the undersecretary to get award letters out earlier, and that's a very difficult thing to do if you don't move your priority deadline, because the alternative to that is first come, first serve, which I think we all probably here know would be perhaps more detrimental for low-income students. So we also are really, again, encouraging our members to just be careful and thoughtful in any deadlines that they're moving. But as I said earlier, I think many, sort of along with what NACAC is suggesting, are waiting and seeing, and what's happening, what are my competitors doing, and so we don't have sort of a standard piece of guidance that we're giving on financial aid deadlines right now, other than to really be mindful. We believe, I said this earlier, but I think it's important to stress that schools know their populations well, and so many schools work with certain, their local college access networks and things like that, and so we want to make sure if schools are changing anything, that they're talking to the right people, making sure that they're aware, so that students, and particularly low-income students, aren't missing out on the deadlines. And again, I think it's worth saying, I know I said it earlier, but that word deadline really does mean only so much. There usually is additional funds available, and I think especially in this year, schools are being extra careful to make sure to leave extra funds.
Yeah, I know enrollment managers all over the country are driving up web traffic at their competitors' websites when looking at financial aid deadlines, net price calculator. I mean, more so, that always happens, but certainly more so this year than ever before. So Lou, I want to go back to this idea of, and certainly your perspective from NACAC is huge for this, but do you think that the early FAFSA is eventually going to change the recruitment calendar? And the big one that's out there is May 1st a thing of the past? Is May 1st going to turn into March 1st because of this change?
Well, I guess we have heard some of that. Again, I'm tempted to say be careful what you ask for. With May 1, summer melt for most institutions is a 3-month phenomenon. We move it up to March 1, and it's now a 5-month phenomenon. Adam, you're an enrollment manager. You sort of have to ask yourself, how would you like 5 months of sweating out melt rather than just 3? That's one consequence. Another, though, and it's one I frankly haven't heard discussed all that much, is the impacts on simply the senior year of high school. You get more and more kids who have all their college decisions all set, signed, and delivered much earlier than was usual. It really decimates the senior year. It leads to kids, I think, becoming less engaged with school, and I think that's a huge problem for our high school counseling colleagues. But there's even a problem, I think, for enrollment managers, and that is simply what we know about student development. A 17-year-old who makes a college decision or is encouraged to make a final decision as early as December of the senior year is a very different human being from the kid you see on May 1. And I wonder if we aren't going to be seeing a lot more of buyer's remorse on the part of students, a lot more of mismatching of kids to colleges, precisely because maybe earlier from that standpoint isn't such a good idea. That would be my take.
That's a great point, and I've often been thinking about this as it relates to college athletics and the recruitment in college athletics. This idea that we're putting pressure on 16 and 17-year-olds to commit to a university for athletics in their sophomore or junior year in high school, even kind of has shown us that this is a flawed strategy, right? I mean, you see a student making a decision to attend X, Y, and Z university as a sophomore. As a junior, they're attending a different college, and on National Signing Day, they choose a third institution where they ultimately end up. And if that happens on the whole, I think that is a huge challenge for enrollment management, and particularly offices of admission. And that's one challenge that I do not want to deal with, as you alluded to. I don't want to spread out that summer melt any more than it is already. But you did allude to, you mentioned high school counselors, so I did want to ask you about that. I know you work very closely with them as part of your role as chair of the compliance. So what is their reaction to this point about prior year?
Well, I'm really concerned, and it's coming primarily from school counselors who work at under-resourced high schools and serve lots of students who have very high financial need. The problem from their standpoint is this: if you're a low-income kid, and maybe coming from a household that's not even English-speaking, you're very reliant on school counselors. I know of school counselors who sit with kids and file the FAFSAs for them from their own computer terminals. I even know of one who has tax returns from their students in her locked file cabinet because she has to enter the information that way. Now, they do that activity in February and March, and they've allocated time to work one-on-one with kids and getting FAFSAs filed. The early FAFSA may force them to start doing this not in February or March, but instead October and November. Well, guess what? It's not as if they're doing nothing in October and November right now. Their calendars and their schedules are very, very full. So they're being forced to think about, how do you possibly conflate advising these kids about college choices and at the same time handling in this very personalized ways what's needed to file a FAFSA. That's a tough issue for them, and I don't myself know what the good answer is at this stage.
Yeah, no, it's a tough spot. It's a tough spot for everybody. I think the changing calendar in particular just is going to take a lot of just flexibility to adapt to these new changes, and I think school counselors are a population that's going to be directly affected. Well, this hour has blown by, so I want to move to some final thoughts from you guys that I know people out there want to hear. So Lou, I'm going to keep you going. I know I'm working you right now, but we're going to keep going. And I've always worked at an institution. It's a majority. 50% of my population identifies as first-generation college students. So I am always scared and worried about any type of changes to deadlines, to policies, procedures, particularly rather abrupt changes and major changes, frankly. So how do you see this playing out, particularly for that type of student population?
Yeah, I'm worried. Megan, you alluded earlier to schools that allocate aid on a first-come, first-served basis. And ironically, the early FAFSA may advantage kids who come from wealthy families and disadvantage kids from less wealthy families precisely for that reason at schools that do that. Because a family that's more well off can be on top of this. They can file the FAFSA earlier. They're first in line to get the aid that's distributed on a first-come, first-served basis. It's the low-income family, the first-generation kid, who's less likely to be savvy and whose only recourse is to work with a school counselor who is very overworked, has very high counseling loads, and I do feel some concern about what this could mean. I wish institutions that do first come, first served would rethink that policy and just rethink it from the standpoint of just equity. But until that happens, that's going to be a problem, and that's one concern that I have.
And I completely agree. And I think we're trying to be very proactive, and particularly working with our feeder high schools and getting our financial aid staff out there as early as possible this school year to do financial aid presentations and to really promote much earlier the idea of, this is here, you got to get used to it. These are the things that you have to do, and you have to do it before Christmas. If you want to be in line to get financial aid at those institutions that are first come, first served. But that is definitely a concern I think all across the country. And I think as we see students kind of go through the cycle, and if there are institutions that quote unquote run out of aid late in the cycle for a qualified applicant, we're going to kind of hear that uproar, and that may lead to changes down the line. So I want to turn to Isaiah and get his final thought, and it's a very simple question. I mean, do you think that this change is a benefit for recruiters like yourself, or is this something that you really just got to take a wait-and-see approach?
Sure, I am very much a positive person. I operate with the power of positivity here, and I do view it as a positive change, for recruiters and admissions counselors. I think it allows us to engage with the families a little bit sooner and really guide them through this enrollment process in terms of either making decisions, making sure the appropriate forms are filled out, and make sure that they feel confident as they're going through the college search process. I also think that it allows us to continue to strengthen those relationships with our colleagues in financial aid. And as we're working on a family together, how can I assist them in their role, and how can they assist me as well? And so I think it's a positive there, in making sure that the college's goals are met, but then also the family's roles are met in terms of furthering their education.
The admission guy is shining through on you, and I love it. Fantastic. And then finally, Megan, for you, can you just talk a little bit about what we can expect from NASFA in terms of guidance, in terms of training, and evaluation of PPY in the next year?
Yeah, we're going to really continue our work on implementation, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do some follow-up after October 1 in the fall and in the spring again, surveying members, learning about what institutions are doing or not doing that's working or not working. So this for us is going to be sort of a several-year endeavor, and we do believe, I mean, this is one thing I would just say is that reminding folks that if there is some angst, I mean, this is a major public policy change for admissions and financial aid, one of the biggest that we've seen in the past 5 or 6 years. So there probably will be some speed bumps this first year, so I think we all need to sort of expect that, and then it'll be kind of our job and everyone's collective job to look at it and see what we can do differently. And I would also just add, from the perspective of being here in Washington, that there's a lot to get done on the campuses, and we totally agree with that, and we're working on that. But there could also be some other policy implications, and we're getting ready to reauthorize the Higher Ed Act. And just so you all know, we work very closely with other organizations here in DC. Probably 2 or 3 times a month, we have meetings with NACAC and with the registrars and with the bursars to all sit down and talk about this issue and what's going on. So we're doing our best here to not be sort of in the tunnel vision world of financial aid, but seeing how we can help everyone work together.
Awesome. Well, we're definitely looking forward to that. I can't believe how quickly this hour went by. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think this episode was very groundbreaking in terms of changing the conversation about just the general, nuts and bolts of prior year, and to really talk about how it is going to affect people, whether that's students, whether that's parents, whether that's school counselors, whether that's NACAC, NASFA, and everybody in between, and certainly the admission counselors that are doing the recruiting. So fantastic, and I do thank you guys so much for being a part of Admissions Live. I also want to thank our program sponsor, Chegg. You guys are fantastic as well. We will be back next month with your NACAC National Conference Primer. I look forward to it. Have a great day, everybody, and have a great kickoff to the fall semester.